Ladies and gentlemen, dwellers of the modern mind, I bid you listen as if myth itself were whispering through the walls of this room. I stand before you not merely as a man, but as the echo of ancient gods who have long fallen silent. Today, I invite you to gaze into the hourglass of our shared soul. The sands within contain the forgotten gods of humanity beneath the surface of our modern lives, hidden in the marrow of our being. There move powers that we scarcely recognize. They were once gods, worshipped and feared, given temples and names, shaping the destiny of entire peoples. Today they are silent, not because they have vanished, but because we have forgotten them. They lie dormant in the unconscious, disinherited by our rational age. Yet their energies remain as insistent as the blood in our veins. What is forgotten is not destroyed. It changes form, appearing as compulsions, obsessions, unexplained moods, or the strange magnetism of certain images that seize us and refuse release. These are the gods, stripped to their temples, roaming as restless archetypal forces in the unseen regions of our psyche. The modern person believes he has escaped the reign of gods by pronouncing them illusions. He imagines himself emancipated, the ruler of his own house. Yet the more loudly he proclaims the gods dead, the more secretly they take possession of him. They infiltrate politics, mass movements, and personal neuroses. The god of war, long denied his altar, reappears in the frenzy of collective violence. The god of desire manifests in compulsive consumption, in the endless hunger of the marketplace. The goddess of wisdom, ignored, withers into sterile intellect, clever but soulless, divorced from living mystery. What was once encountered in ritual and myth now erupts unconsciously, uncontrolled and destructive. These forgotten deities are not external beings floating in some metaphysical ether. They are the deepest structures of the psyche. They are patterns older than memory, prefigurations of human experience, shaping the way we dream, love, fear, and seek meaning. They once clothed themselves in myth and sacred image so that we might relate to them, recognize their presence, and order our lives in harmony with them. To forget them is to live without orientation, to wander like exiles in our own inner landscape. The soul hungers for images, for symbols through which to engage these primordial forces. When denied, the hunger twists into pathology. Consider the man who imagines himself entirely rational, dismissing all myth as childish. He prides himself on his clarity of mind, yet he is beset by nameless anxieties. He cannot sleep. He feels pursued by vague terrors he cannot name. The gods he denies rise instead as symptoms. Or think of the society that banishes the sacred in favor of endless productivity and material gain. It believes itself progressive, yet finds itself haunted by epidemics of despair, addictions, and outbreaks of collective rage. This is the revenge of the forgotten gods. The hourglass becomes our symbol here. With each falling grain of sand, another fragment of ancient memory slips away from conscious life. The gods grow dim, their temples crumble, and we believe we have advanced beyond them. Yet the sand does not vanish. It collects below in the unconscious. There the deities wait, neither alive nor dead, demanding return. When the lower chamber fills, the hourglass must be inverted, and once more the forgotten images rise into awareness. This inversion is the work of individuation, the slow, patient turning of the soul toward what it has neglected. To remember the gods is not to worship them as our ancestors did. It is to recognize their living reality as archetypal patterns, to give them symbolic form again, to re-establish dialogue with the powers that shape us. They cannot be banished by disbelief. They can only be made conscious. When they are seen, named, and honored in the imagination, they become allies rather than tyrants. The god of war becomes disciplined courage rather than blind violence. The goddess of love becomes devotion and intimacy rather than compulsive possession. The god of wisdom becomes inner guidance, not sterile cleverness. Each archetype, when remembered, restores a lost dimension of life. But this remembering is no simple task. To open oneself to the gods is to risk being torn apart by their power. One must descend into dreams, visions, and symbols, and there encounter figures that are not invented, but given. They appear unbidden, with a numinous weight that cannot be reduced to mere fancy. They carry the authority of something eternal, something greater than personal whim. To engage with them requires humility, for they reveal to us how small the ego truly is. The conscious mind is but an island, the gods are the ocean surrounding it. The forgotten gods do not return politely. They break in through crises, through breakdowns, through uncanny encounters that shatter the smooth surface of daily life. An illness, a loss, a sudden passion. These may be the masks of archetypal forces demanding recognition. What we call fate is often nothing other than the insistence of the gods to be remembered. Each turning point in a life bears their imprint. When a man discovers a vocation that seizes him with irresistible urgency, it is not he who chooses. It is a god that has chosen him. If we look at the myths of old, we see how each god had its domain, its proper sphere. This ordering was wisdom. Today, without myth, the domains bleed into one another. The god of desire spills over into politics. The god of war invades the family. The god of reason colonizes the heart. The forgetting of the gods is not liberation, but chaos. To restore them to symbolic consciousness is to restore order, to give each force its rightful place in the psychic cosmos. The task of our time is not to invent new gods, but to recognize the old ones under their new disguises. They walk among us in the images of film and literature, in the obsessions of mass culture, in the dreams of ordinary people. They are hidden in plain sight, but without the language of symbol, we fail to recognize them. To study myth and symbol is not an antiquarian pastime. It is a necessity for psychic survival. The soul requires these images as the body requires food. Without them, it starves, and yet the reawakening of these archetypal powers must not mean regression. We cannot simply return to the cults of antiquity, for we are no longer ancient men and women. The gods must be integrated into the modern psyche, woven into the fabric of individuality. They call not for literal worship, but for conscious relationship. The temple today is inward. The sacrifice is the ego's pride. To engage with the gods is to allow the unconscious its voice, to permit the deeper layers of psyche to participate in shaping our lives. Active imagination becomes the doorway. In silence, in vision, we allow the forgotten gods to speak. We do not invent their words, we receive them just as dream images are received. This is not fantasy, but encounter. One converses with the goddess of wisdom, with the god of rage, with the shadowy figure who has haunted one's dreams. In such dialogues, one learns the language of the psyche, the syntax of myth. The gods, when listened to, reveal their demands, their gifts, their dangers. They are no longer strangers, but companions on the path. To deny these encounters is to condemn oneself to possession. What we refuse to make conscious rules us from the dark. A man who denies the god of power may suddenly find himself overwhelmed by uncontrollable rage. A woman who represses the goddess of love may be seized by destructive passions. What is repressed returns, but in distorted form. Only when recognized as archetypal energy can the god take its rightful, constructive place in the psyche. There is, too, a collective dimension. Civilizations rise and fall by virtue of the gods they honor or forget. The decline of myth in modern times is not accidental. It is the symptom of a culture that has exalted the ego above the soul. Technology and reason have become our idols, but they are poor gods, narrow and one-sided. The forgotten deities stir beneath, seeking to reassert themselves. If not recognized, they may erupt as mass psychoses, wars, or cultural collapses. To remember the gods is not only an individual task, but a collective necessity. Thus, the hourglass continues to flow. Each grain of time carries us further from the ancient temples, yet deeper into the realm of the unconscious where the gods now dwell. The choice is ours, to remain forgetful, living as though we were self-sufficient, until the gods return in catastrophic form, or to turn the hourglass consciously, to allow their images to rise into awareness, to integrate them into the wholeness of the self. The forgotten gods are not enemies. They are the roots of our humanity, the eternal patterns that give life depth and meaning. To live without them is to live shallowly, on the surface of existence, always restless, always hungry, never fulfilled. To live with them is to be rooted, to dwell in myth, to walk with symbols that connect us to the timeless. It is to know that one's life participates in a story larger than the individual. Therefore, the call is not to banish or to worship blindly, but to remember. To remember is to heal, to bring into consciousness what has been disowned. The gods do not demand belief, they demand attention. They require the offering of our imagination, our willingness to dialogue with them, our humility to recognize forces greater than ourselves moving within us. When we make this offering, they return not as tyrants, but as guides, enriching our lives with meaning and depth. And so, the forgotten deities wait, silent yet powerful, in the chambers of the unconscious. They are the dreams that trouble us, the passions that seize us, the stories that haunt us. They are both our danger and our salvation. Whether we choose to remember them, to give them form and voice, will determine the shape of our future. For no culture, no individual, can live long cut off from the gods. The hourglass runs and the sands remind us. What is forgotten must one day be remembered. Deep within the human being, there lies a mystery that cannot be measured by time, a living reservoir that stretches beyond the boundaries of personal life. Each individual, no matter how solitary, is connected to it, as a tree is connected to the soil from which it grows. This reservoir is not a product of our personal experience, nor is it created by education or environment. It is older than memory, older than language, older even than the cultures that have risen and fallen across the millennia. It is the timeless storehouse of images and patterns, a hidden architecture of the soul, shaping us silently from within. Every human being is born into the world carrying this inheritance. Long before the child learns its first words, long before it is touched by culture or instruction, its dreams already reveal images that are not personal inventions. A child dreams of animals speaking, of mysterious strangers, of journeys into unknown landscapes. These are not fantasies derived from conscious learning. They belong to something deeper, an inheritance written into the psyche as surely as the body carries the traces of evolutionary history. Just as the shape of the hand recalls a lineage of adaptation, so the images of the psyche recall the journey of humanity through ages past. This reservoir is timeless because it does not belong to any one era. It does not decay with the passing of generations. The figures that lived in the myths of Egypt, Greece, India, or the tribal peoples of forgotten continents still live in us today. They appear in our dreams, in our fears, in our sudden exaltations. We imagine ourselves modern, yet when we close our eyes at night, we walk among gods and monsters no different from those our ancestors encountered in their sacred stories. What was once carved in stone now lives in the silent chambers of the unconscious. It is not only myth and legend that draw from this source, but also the everyday struggles of the soul. When a man meets a woman and feels himself overtaken by a force greater than desire, he has encountered an ancient pattern, the image of the anima, the eternal feminine, stirring in his depths. When a woman confronts her own inner authority, stern and uncompromising, she meets the archetype of the animus, the eternal masculine. These figures are not invented. They arise spontaneously from the reservoir, shaping the way relationships are lived and understood. Without knowledge of their origin, we are at their mercy. With recognition, they become guides to self-knowledge. This depth is a treasury of symbols. Consider how, across continents, humanity has imagined the serpent as a sacred image. To some it was wisdom, to others temptation, to others renewal and healing. Why should so many diverse peoples imagine the same creature in such powerful symbolic roles? It is because the serpent belongs to the timeless patterns of the unconscious. It is not we who created the symbol, it is the symbol that created us, that guided our imagination long before we took up the tools of thought. In this sense, human creativity is never truly original. What we call invention is in truth a re-encounter with images already waiting in the depths. The artist, the poet, the prophet, They do not construct ex nihilo. They become vessels for the reservoir, through which ancient forms take new shape. This is why genuine art feels timeless. It stirs something in us that we did not know we remembered. A painting, a poem, a melody awakens recognition in the heart, as though we had always known it. This recognition is the echo of the reservoir, reminding us that we are not isolated beings, but participants in an ancient continuity. The timeless nature of this storehouse becomes evident in dreams. Night after night, each of us descends into it, whether we know it or not. In dreams, the masks of the day fall away, and we find ourselves confronted with images both strange and familiar. We meet old wise men, shadowy figures, radiant beings of light, or terrifying monsters. We travel through landscapes that feel ancient, sacred, or threatening. These dream images are not random. They are messages from the reservoir, attempts of the deeper psyche to communicate with the surface consciousness. To ignore them is to cut oneself off from the living roots of one's being. To attend to them is to begin a dialogue with the timeless within. Yet modern man, proud of his reason, often dismisses these inner voices. He believes that reality lies only in what can be measured, dissected, or catalogued. But the consequence of this dismissal is emptiness, for the rational mind, stripped of myth, floats rootless in the void. It no longer participates in the eternal stories, and thus it no longer understands itself. This is why, despite material progress, modern humanity often feels plagued by anxiety and despair. It has lost contact with the timeless reservoir, and so it drifts, driven by forces it refuses to acknowledge. But the reservoir does not vanish when ignored. It continues to act, shaping lives from the shadows. What is repressed below returns in distorted form above. Entire nations may be seized by archetypal energies that erupt unconsciously. The god of war rising in collective hysteria, the shadow of fear projected onto entire peoples, the longing for redemption twisted into destructive cults. What is not integrated by the individual becomes fate for the collective. To neglect the timeless within is to invite disaster. The task, therefore, is remembrance. To live in conscious relationship with the reservoir is not to surrender reason, but to place it in service of a greater wholeness. Reason must learn to listen, not dominate. It must recognize that the human being is not self-created, but born into a mystery larger than any individual mind. This humility opens the door to dialogue with the unconscious. It allows the images that rise from the depths to be received, contemplated, and integrated. One does not master the reservoir, one learns to relate to it. This relationship is always paradoxical. On the one hand, it humbles the ego, revealing that we are not the authors of our own lives, but participants in a drama that began long before us. On the other hand, it ennobles the individual, for to recognize oneself as part of this drama is to recognize one's significance. The smallest life is linked to the great story of humanity. Each person carries within them the possibility of embodying timeless patterns in a unique and personal form. This is why the journey inward is not a retreat from life, but an entry into its depth. To turn toward dreams, fantasies, and symbols is not escapism. It is to recognize that our daily struggles are intertwined with eternal realities. When we wrestle with the shadow, we are not merely confronting personal flaws. We are engaging an archetype that has shaped human consciousness from the beginning. When we are seized by love, we are not merely indulging in personal passion. We are enacting an ancient union that myths have sung of for centuries. Our lives are small mirrors of the timeless reservoir, and through them, eternity finds expression in time. To live without awareness of this is to live like a leaf believing itself separate from the tree. It may flutter for a season, but it has no sense of its belonging. To awaken to the reservoir is to realize that one's roots are sunk deep in the soil of the collective soul, drawing nourishment from sources one cannot see. This realization does not diminish individuality, it deepens it. For individuality is not achieved by cutting oneself off from the collective, but by consciously differentiating oneself while remaining rooted in it. There is, of course, danger in approaching such depths. To descend without guidance is to risk being overwhelmed. The figures of the reservoir are powerful, and they can possess the unwary. History is filled with examples of individuals who fell under the sway of archetypal energies, mistaking them for personal destiny or divine command, and thus were consumed by them. The path requires discernment, a careful balance between openness and critical reflection. One must neither deny the images nor be devoured by them. The goal is integration, to allow the archetypal forces to inform life without dominating it. This integration is the work of a lifetime. It is not accomplished in a single vision or a single insight. It is a slow weaving together of consciousness and unconscious, a dialogue that deepens over years. At times, the reservoir reveals itself in sudden illuminations, a dream that changes the course of a life, a vision that breaks open the heart. At other times, it whispers quietly, offering symbols whose meaning unfolds only gradually. The task is to remain attentive, to cultivate patience, and to trust that the soul knows more than the conscious mind can grasp. In the end, the timeless reservoir is not an abstract theory, but a lived reality. It is felt in the trembling of awe before beauty, in the terror of nightmares, in the quiet wisdom of intuition, in the strange sense of recognition when encountering a story or symbol that speaks directly to the soul. It is the source of both our greatest sufferings and our deepest joys. To live in harmony with it is to live in wholeness. To ignore it is to live half a life, cut off from the roots of being. Thus, each person is called to turn inward, to listen to the voices that rise from the depths, to recognize the images that shape dreams and fantasies, to honor the patterns that link us to all humanity. This is not a matter of belief, but of experience. One need not believe in the reservoir to feel its influence. It is there regardless. The only question is whether we will recognize it and learn to walk in conscious relationship with it, or whether we will continue to drift, possessed by forces we refuse to name. The timeless reservoir is the ground of our being, the hidden spring from which all human life flows. To approach it with reverence is to participate in the mystery of existence itself. And though it cannot be exhausted, each grain of sand that passes through the hourglass of our lives is an invitation to remember. We are not solitary wanderers in time, but bearers of eternity, carrying within us the memory of gods, myths, and dreams that never die. Time, like a silent sculptor, works upon the human soul. Its grains fall without pause, unheeding of our wishes, and in their ceaseless descent they carry away more than just hours and years. They carry away fragments of our awareness, moments of meaning, forgotten images, neglected potentials. With each fall of sand, something of our inner life slips into shadow. Yet time is not only a thief, it is also the revealer. For in the falling of the sand lies the task of reclaiming what has been lost, of gathering from the darkness the treasures that have sunk beneath. This reclamation is what gives life depth. It is the slow and perilous path by which a human being becomes whole. Most of us live only on the surface, swept along by the relentless current of time. We chase after the next moment, the next achievement, the next distraction. We imagine that the meaning of life is found in progress, in accumulation, in the restless pursuit of more. But this is only half of the story. Time does not simply lead us forward, it also buries us. The unlived life, the forgotten dream, the disowned impulse, all these sink like grains into the lower chamber of the hourglass. What we refuse to face in the present becomes the hidden content of the unconscious. There it waits, not lifeless, but gathering weight and energy until the pressure becomes unbearable. To walk the path of individuation is to turn toward these lost grains. It is to refuse the easy illusion that we can leave them behind. Each dream, each symptom, each unexpected eruption of feeling is a signal from below, a whisper from what has been forgotten. Individuation is not the invention of a new self, but the recollection of the whole that has always been present. It is the work of gathering the dispersed fragments of being and weaving them into unity. But this work demands courage, for it requires a descent. The ego, proud of its mastery, resists. It wants to stand upon the narrow peak of consciousness, surveying the world in daylight, pretending that what lies in shadow does not exist. Yet the shadow grows, and the hourglass does not cease to flow. Eventually, the neglected truths of the soul insist upon recognition. If they are denied, they return in destructive ways. Compulsions, breakdowns, conflicts that shatter the fragile illusion of control. In this sense, suffering is often the summons to individuation. Pain is the language of the unlived life, calling us to reclaim what has been buried. Individuation is not a turning away from life, but a turning more deeply into it. It asks us to look at ourselves not as we wish to appear, but as we truly are. It asks us to acknowledge the shadow, the impulses, desires, and fears we have disowned. It asks us to recognize that we are not merely what we present to the world, but also what we hide even from ourselves. To face the shadow is to recover the sand we once let slip through our fingers, to reclaim the rejected aspects of our own humanity. Yet individuation does not stop with the shadow. Beyond the shadow lies the anima or animus, the contrasexual image that draws us into relation with the depths. This figure carries the key to creativity, imagination, and spiritual transformation. In dreams, it may appear as a mysterious woman or a guiding man, offering both temptation and wisdom. To engage with this figure is to enter into dialogue with the unconscious itself. It is to allow the hidden depths to speak, and to recognize that the soul is not a barren mechanism, but a living mystery that longs to unfold. As the work deepens, other figures emerge: the wise old man, the great mother, the trickster, the hero. Each is an expression of an archetypal pattern, a shape older than the individual, drawn from the timeless storehouse of the human spirit. To meet these figures is to realize that our lives are not merely personal, but symbolic. We are not isolated egos wandering in chaos. We are participants in a story as ancient as humanity. Each stage of life carries its archetypal task, its demand for recognition and integration. Individuation is the process by which these figures are not merely encountered, but woven into the fabric of the self. It is the slow building of a center that can contain them, a center not identical with the ego, but larger, deeper, more encompassing. This center is the self, the totality of the psyche, the union of conscious and unconscious. The ego alone is too fragile to bear the weight of time's sand. It clings to control, and thus it shatters when confronted with forces greater than itself. But the self is spacious enough to hold them all, to reconcile opposites, to bring order out of conflict. The journey toward the self is not linear. It is more like a spiral, circling again and again around the same themes, each time at a deeper level. The shadow confronted once returns later in subtler forms. The anima or animus reveals itself through many masks, each demanding recognition. The wise old man may first appear as an external authority, only later to be discovered within. At each turn of the spiral, more sand is reclaimed, more of the unconscious is brought into consciousness, and the wholeness of the self becomes more visible. Time itself becomes the great teacher. Youth believes it has endless sand, and so it squanders its grains. It rushes forward, impatient with limits, intoxicated with possibility. Middle age discovers that the hourglass is not infinite, that much has already slipped away. It feels the weight of unlived life pressing from below, and it begins to hear the call of individuation more urgently. Old age, if it has listened well, may finally come to see that the hourglass is not only a measure of loss, but a symbol of transformation. The sand that has fallen is not wasted. It has become the foundation of wisdom, the sediment upon which the self is built. In this sense, death itself is not annihilation, but consummation. As the last grains fall, the ego surrenders its illusion of permanence, yet the self, which has always encompassed more than the ego, reveals its timelessness. What has been integrated, what has been reclaimed, does not vanish. It becomes part of the eternal story of humanity, another strand woven into the tapestry of the collective soul. But to reach such a vision is rare, for the path is arduous. It demands that we abandon our certainties, that we risk madness in order to find sanity, that we descend into darkness in order to find light. It is a path of paradox. We must lose ourselves to find ourselves. We must die to the ego to be born to the self. The world around us urges us to avoid this path, to remain content with surfaces, to chase endlessly after the next distraction. Yet beneath the noise, the soul waits, and time's sand continues to fall. The work of individuation is not reserved for the mystic or the genius. It is the birthright of every human being. Each person, in their own way, is called to reclaim the forgotten sand of their own life. For one, it may mean facing the anger long denied. For another, it may mean embracing the creativity long suppressed. For some, it may be the task of reconciling with the past. For others, of opening to the future. Each path is unique, yet all paths lead toward the same center, the same wholeness that has been waiting all along. And though the task is solitary, it is not isolated. Each who undertakes it becomes a bearer of meaning for the community. For when one person integrates the shadow, they lessen the burden of collective violence. When one person embraces their inner image, they enrich the field of human relationship. When one person embodies the self, they radiate a presence that nourishes all around them. Individuation is not selfish. It is the most profound service to the world. Thus, the hourglass is not only a symbol of mortality, but of transformation. Each grain that falls is an invitation to remember, to reclaim, to integrate. The sand that lies below is not dead. It waits to be lifted, to be made conscious, to be woven into the living fabric of the self. Time is relentless, but it is also generous, offering us moment after moment to undertake the work. The only question is whether we will heed the call, or whether we will let the grain slip away unnoticed, until the glass is empty and the opportunity lost. To live the path of individuation is to walk consciously with time. It is to see each falling grain not as loss, but as summons. It is to understand that nothing essential is ever truly lost. It only waits to be reclaimed. In this work we do not escape time, but we learn to live within it as participants in a deeper order. We discover that the hourglass, rather than a symbol of despair, is a vessel of transformation, turning endlessly, reminding us that the task is always before us, and that wholeness is always within reach. Myth is not a story told merely for amusement or for the curiosity of the scholar. It is the oldest language of the soul, the speech through which the unconscious once made itself known to humanity. Long before there were systems of philosophy or doctrines of theology, human beings gathered around fires and spoke in symbols, weaving into story what they sensed stirring within and around them. These stories were not inventions in the way that a novelist constructs a plot. They arose spontaneously, as dreams do, from the depths of Psyche, carrying truths that reason could not yet grasp. Myth was the vessel in which the wisdom of the soul was preserved, the medicine through which it healed itself. When we dismiss myth as superstition, as primitive fancy, we imagine ourselves enlightened. We believe we have advanced beyond the need for such tales, armed with science and reason. Yet what is repressed in the collective always returns. When myth is denied, it does not disappear. It reemerges in unconscious forms, shaping our lives without our awareness. Modern people who laugh at the gods still bow unknowingly to their power, enacting ancient dramas under new names. The myth of conquest, the myth of progress, the myth of the savior or destroyer. These grip us no less strongly than the stories of Zeus or Osiris once gripped ancient peoples. The soul cannot live without myth. If we refuse the old stories, we invent new ones, but always it is myth that breathes life into our actions. The reason for this lies in the very structure of the psyche. Within each of us are archetypes, primordial patterns of experience that give shape to our emotions, desires, and conflicts. These archetypes are not accessible to consciousness in their raw form. They are too vast, too overwhelming. They come clothed in images, in symbols, in narratives. Myth is the natural clothing of the archetype. the form it assumes, so that we may approach it without being annihilated. Just as a dream presents our conflicts in symbolic form, so that we may engage them, so myth presents the archetypal dramas of the collective soul. When the hero sets out upon his journey, armed with little more than courage and a faint sense of destiny, we are not simply entertained. We are watching the drama of our own growth, the necessity of leaving behind the familiar, the inevitability of trials and transformations. When the goddess descends into the underworld to rescue what has been lost, we are not hearing a quaint fable. We are being instructed in the soul's own task to descend into the depths, to face darkness, and to bring forth what lies hidden. These stories are not foreign, they are mirrors. In them, the soul recognizes itself and finds strength to endure its own trials. The healing power of myth lies precisely in this recognition. What is unconscious becomes conscious when it is encountered in symbolic form. A person tormented by anxiety may find no relief in rational analysis, yet when they encounter the image of a hero facing a dragon, something stirs within them. They recognize that their fear is not meaningless but part of an ancient struggle, that within them too lies the possibility of courage. Another person grieving the death of a loved one may find no consolation in logical explanations, but when they hear the myth of Isis gathering the scattered pieces of Osiris, they feel their sorrow placed within a larger pattern. Myth gives shape to suffering, and in giving shape it brings healing. Modern medicine often treats the body while neglecting the soul. We mend bones, we quiet symptoms, we extend life, but we do not ask what meaning the illness carries, what story is being enacted through the affliction. Yet the soul seeks meaning even in pain. Without meaning, suffering becomes unbearable. With meaning, it can be endured and even transformed. Myth offers this meaning. It teaches us that our personal struggles are not isolated, that they belong to the eternal dramas of humanity. To suffer is not merely to be unlucky. It is to participate in the myth of the wounded healer, the dying and rising God, the descent and return. The absence of myth in modern life has left us impoverished. We have gained technical mastery, but at the cost of inner orientation. Surrounded by machines and abstractions, we find ourselves haunted by emptiness. We seek to fill the void with distractions, with endless entertainment, with the mythologies of celebrity and consumption. But these are poor substitutes. They do not speak to the depths of the soul, they only anesthetize the surface. The soul grows sick when deprived of true myth, just as the body grows sick when deprived of nourishment. To heal, we must listen again. The myths of the past are not dead relics, they are living voices. They call to us from the depths of time, waiting to be heard anew. Each generation must reinterpret them, for their language is symbolic, not literal. We do not need to believe that Hercules once physically slew monsters, but we must recognize that each of us faces dragons of fear, greed, and despair. We do not need to worship Demeter in a temple, but we must honor the truth that grief is a descent into darkness, and that renewal comes only through patience and faith. The myths live when we find in them reflections of our own inner journey. Dreams, too, are myths in miniature. Each night, the unconscious spins its own stories, drawing upon the same archetypal patterns that gave rise to ancient legend. If we attend to them, if we write them down and reflect upon them, we find ourselves participating in the eternal myth-making of the psyche. A dream of being pursued, of falling, of discovering hidden rooms, these are not trivial. They are messages from the unconscious, attempts of the soul to heal itself by telling its story. To ignore them is to refuse the medicine offered each night. The practice of engaging myth is not escapism. On the contrary, it grounds us in reality more deeply, for the reality of the psyche is not confined to what the senses perceive. The psyche speaks in images, and to deny these images is to deny half of our being. To live mythically is to live with awareness of the symbolic dimension of life. It is to recognize that events are not only external, but also internal, that what happens in the world resonates with patterns within the soul. It is to walk through life attentive to signs, to dreams, to symbols, and to find in them guidance. Consider how many feel lost in modern society, unsure of purpose, adrift in a sea of options. Without myth, there is no orientation. The soul longs for a path, a story to belong to. Myth provides this. It tells us, you are on a journey, you will be tested, you will be wounded, you will descend into darkness, and you will return, transformed, bearing a gift for others. To live with this awareness is to live with meaning, even amid hardship. The greatest danger of our time is not material poverty but spiritual starvation. Surrounded by abundance, many feel hollow, because abundance without myth is empty. It is like feasting without nourishment. True healing comes not from more possessions, but from reconnection with the story that gives life shape. When the soul remembers its myth, even the smallest act becomes meaningful. Planting a seed, caring for a child, enduring an illness, all become part of a sacred drama. The myths also remind us that we are not alone. They connect us with ancestors, with cultures long gone, with the collective experience of humanity. When we read the Epic of Gilgamesh, we find that the grief of an ancient king mirrors our own grief today. When we hear of Inanna's descent, we recognize the pattern of our own depressions and renewals. Myth bridges time, uniting us with all who have walked before. This connection itself is medicine, for isolation is one of the deepest wounds of the soul. To know that one's suffering is part of a larger story is to be accompanied, to be strengthened. Ultimately, myth leads us toward wholeness. It does not eliminate suffering, but it reveals its meaning. It does not spare us from death, but it shows us that death is part of the eternal cycle of transformation. It does not free us from conflict, but it teaches us that conflict is the crucible in which new life is born. Myth heals by reminding us that we are participants in a cosmic drama, that our lives, however small, are woven into eternity. To recover myth is to recover soul. It is to allow the old stories to speak again, not as dead echoes, but as living guides. It is to listen to dreams, to symbols, to the quiet voices within. It is to walk through life with reverence, seeing in each trial the echo of an ancient journey, in each joy the blessing of the eternal. Myth is not a luxury, it is the medicine without which the soul cannot thrive. To deny it is to wither, to embrace it is to be made whole. When one turns inward and listens carefully to the depths, one encounters not a void, but a living reality. This reality does not speak in rational arguments, nor appear as orderly concepts, but comes in images, voices, and figures that seem at once alien and intimate. It is here that the practice of active imagination arises, a conscious attempt to enter into dialogue with the unconscious, to give space for its figures to reveal themselves, and to allow the conversation between ego and soul to unfold. This is no idle fantasy or daydreaming. It is a deliberate engagement with the living symbols that inhabit the interior world, a method of approaching the divine within. In our modern condition, where the outer world consumes attention with endless distractions, few realize that the inner life continues regardless. Dreams present themselves each night, filled with strange presences and cryptic messages, but most are forgotten with the morning light. Symptoms arise, anxieties, compulsions, moods, and we treat them as nuisances to be suppressed rather than communications to be understood. Yet behind each dream, each symptom, each unexpected image, there is a deeper voice seeking expression. Active imagination is the path of responding to that voice rather than silencing it. The unconscious is not a dead storehouse of repressed material, but a living creative field, a realm where archetypes move as powers and intelligences. It is from this source that religions have arisen, myths have been told, and visions have shaped civilizations. When we attempt to live cut off from this inner wellspring, we become mechanized, soulless, driven by external forces. But when we dare to turn inward and meet what stirs there, we awaken a dialogue that reorients life itself. Active imagination is one of the most direct ways of restoring this lost conversation between the conscious personality and the deeper ground of being. The process begins with openness. One must approach the unconscious as one would approach a stranger of great dignity, neither with arrogance nor fear, but with respect. A dream image may serve as the entry point, a figure seen in the night, a place glimpsed, an animal encountered. One holds the image before the mind, allowing it to unfold, and then one speaks to it. The task is not to control or to force, but to listen. One may ask the figure, "Who are you? What do you want from me? Why have you appeared?" And then, in the stillness of attention, a response emerges. Sometimes it comes as words heard inwardly, sometimes as a new image or a shift in feeling. The dialogue continues, and through it, the unconscious reveals something of its meaning. In such moments, one discovers that the psyche is not a monologue but a chorus. The ego is only one voice among many, and within us there are presences that are wiser, darker, more primal, or more transcendent than the everyday self. To meet them is to discover both danger and blessing, for not all that lives within is benign. The shadow also speaks, demanding acknowledgement of what we would rather repress. Yet even the dark figures have their place, for they guard treasures of energy and truth that the conscious personality has refused. To engage them through active imagination is to bring them into relation, to transform blind compulsion into dialogue. One must, however, avoid inflation. The figures of the unconscious, appearing with numinous power, can overwhelm the ego if taken literally. If one believes oneself to be the god or goddess who appears, or assumes the role of prophet without discernment, madness lies close at hand. The correct attitude is symbolic, to recognize that these figures are manifestations of archetypal energies, clothed in images that the psyche can grasp. They are not to be dismissed as unreal, nor to be mistaken as literal beings outside oneself, but approached as autonomous realities within the soul. This balanced stance, respect without submission, engagement without possession, is the key to fruitful active imagination. Through such dialogues, the soul is healed by being heard. Many suffer because the unconscious has been silenced. The inner child longs for recognition, the neglected feminine seeks voice, the hidden masculine strength demands acknowledgement, but the ego has walled itself off, fearing what might be revealed. Active imagination breaks this wall. It allows the unlived life to speak, and in listening, one finds renewal. The figures encountered often bring messages that are surprising, even unsettling, but they carry precisely what is needed for growth. The divine within does not flatter the ego, it challenges, corrects, and reshapes it. There is also a creative dimension. The images arising through active imagination often take artistic form. They may demand to be drawn, painted, written, or enacted. Many great works of art have emerged in this way, as outer expressions of inner dialogues. The soul speaks in images, and when we give them shape in the world, we participate in creation itself. These works are not made for the sake of aesthetic pleasure alone. They are embodiments of psychic truth, bridges between the inner and outer. In this sense, the practice is not only therapeutic, but also cultural, for it renews the symbolic life of the community. Consider the example of a person tormented by recurring dreams of a dark figure standing at the threshold. Instead of dismissing it, one holds the image, invites the figure to speak. Perhaps the figure reveals itself as the guardian of a long, neglected talent, or as the embodiment of anger repressed since childhood. Through dialogue, what was once a terrifying intruder becomes a guide. The person learns to integrate the energy that was split off, and life takes on new strength. This is the medicine of active imagination. It transforms enemies into allies, strangers into companions, and hidden powers into conscious resources. Yet the deepest encounters go beyond personal material. At times, one meets archetypal presences that transcend the individual altogether. One may dialogue with the wise old man, the great mother, the trickster, or the child. These are not personal fantasies but manifestations of the collective unconscious, the eternal patterns that shape human existence. To speak with them is to touch the divine within, for they are the forms through which the mystery itself enters consciousness. Such encounters often carry an unmistakable numinosity, a sense of standing before something greater than the ego, something that evokes reverence and awe. Through these dialogues, one gradually learns that the divine is not a distant abstraction but an immediate presence. It is not only in temples or scriptures, but in the living images of the soul. The gods that were once worshipped outwardly have not vanished. They now dwell within, awaiting recognition. Active imagination is a way of restoring contact with them, of letting their voices be heard once more. To dialogue with these inner deities is not to regress into primitive superstition, but to acknowledge that the human spirit cannot live without relation to the numinous. The fruit of such work is individuation, the process of becoming whole. For wholeness is not achieved by perfecting the ego or eliminating conflict, but by integrating the many voices of the psyche into a living harmony. Active imagination allows the split-off parts of the soul to return, not as enemies but as partners. In this way, the ego learns humility and openness, and the self, the totality of being, emerges as the guiding center. The dialogue with the divine within thus becomes the foundation of a life lived in accordance with one's deepest truth. One must, however, persevere. The unconscious does not yield its treasures in a single conversation. Like any relationship, it requires time, patience, and sincerity. There will be resistance, silence, confusion. At times the images will seem trivial or absurd, but if one continues faithfully, the dialogue deepens, and the living presence of the soul makes itself known. It is a work of devotion, not unlike prayer, though directed not to a distant deity, but to the inner source of meaning itself. In a world increasingly dominated by noise and fragmentation, this inner dialogue is an act of courage. It requires turning away from distractions and facing what lies within, however uncomfortable. Yet in doing so, one discovers a depth of guidance that no external authority can provide. The divine within speaks with a voice that is uniquely tailored to each individual, addressing their particular path, their unique destiny. To hear this voice is to find orientation in the midst of chaos, to live not as a pawn of collective forces, but as an authentic self. Thus, active imagination is more than a technique. It is a way of life, a stance toward the unconscious that honors its reality and seeks to cooperate with it. It is the art of conversation with the unknown, the courage to listen where one might prefer to command, the humility to learn from what one cannot fully understand. It is, ultimately, the path of reconciling the human with the divine, not through dogma, but through the living experience of dialogue. The soul is not healed by theories, but by being heard, to sit with its images, to converse with its figures, to honor its symbols. This is the medicine. The divine within waits not in the heavens, but in the depths, clothed in the forms of dream and fantasy, ready to speak when we are ready to listen. Active imagination is the opening of that ear, the willingness to converse, the patience to wait for the response. In such dialogue, one does not merely fantasize, one participates in the eternal drama of the psyche, and one discovers again and again that the unknown within is not empty, but full of life, full of presence, full of the divine. And so I leave you, dear travelers of the soul. Each of you holds an hourglass, unseen but palpable. Let the sands nourish, not erode. Let them raise the forgotten gods once more, not as hollow idols, but as living images within. In retrieving them, you do not resurrect the past, but you breathe life into the center of your being. May your psyche become temple, myth, and reunion with the divine. Thank you.